Everybody. Shrikant asked me to host today's meeting. He's not going to be available, so I will do my best to be a good host. And Doug is going to help me in case I slip or do something weird. So anyway, bear with me. So we are going through Dante, and we're now starting on the third part of the comedy, the Paradise. The format for today's session is going to be very similar to what we've done before. I'm going to give a brief overview and share some of, I guess, main ideas that stood out to me. And then we're going to open it up to everyone with your comments, questions, thoughts, anything you want to share in regards to what we've read. And then I'm going to ask Doug to include his own comments and his take on. See, we got somebody else joining here.
I see it, yeah.
I'm going to try and see who that is, but last
I
time
just admitted them, I think.
People being rude and stuff, so we're going to see for anyway. So let's jump in. So again, we just finished Purgatorio, and now we're starting on the first part of Paradise. And so I want to actually, what I like to do whenever we jump from one book to another is to create sort of a connection from where we were to where we're going. And for that, I'd like to read just one verse, the last verse of Purgatorio, because I think it's just so perfect. It's almost like Dante was sitting in on one of the lectures that the English professors like to give, teaching students how to finish a paragraph with a summary and then an introduction to the next idea. And I think Dante must have been a perfect student for one of these English classes, because this last verse is just epitome of good writing. And it says, from that most holy wave, and he's talking about the second river, from that most holy wave, I now return to Beatrice, remade, as new trees are renewed when they bring forth new boughs. I was pure and prepared to climb unto the stars. So what a perfect way to end Purgatorio with, summarizing the main idea of cleansing with that last and final cleansing that he underwent by being dipped into remember the two rivers, the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and the one that actually stirs you to good works and sort of fills in any deficiencies in zeal. And there he is prepared to climb unto the stars. And again, stars, this idea, just like Inferno, when we climb out from the nether regions, we see the stars, and we finish with that thought of stars in heaven. Purgatory is similar, ends with this word stars, stelle in Latin and Italian, actually. And that prepares us for Paradiso, because the main themes are all set. So Paradiso is all about our climb into the stars. And of course, the other big theme that is mentioned is Beatrice. So throughout Inferno and Purgatorio, our guide has been Virgil. And now a big shift is here. Virgil is returned back to Limbo, and Dante is now accompanied by Beatrice. She is the new guide. And one of the things that I want to just point out, and maybe I'm curious what your thoughts are about her as a guide and the dynamics between her and Dante versus the dynamics between Dante and Virgil. I'm curious if people think that Beatrice is a better guide, a more interesting guide, same type of guide, but I'm just curious about that aspect of the poem, because it is a big shift that's coming in Paradiso. The other interesting thing that, as I've read reread, I should say, first 11 cantos, is there's a notable change in style. In some ways, much less poetic and much more scholastic and less narrative. So there's not a lot. I mean, we still read about stories of different characters in Paradiso that we meet. So that scheme is the same. We go to a different sphere, different planet, but the style is much more pedantic, I think. And again, I'm very curious to hear what other people have found as you read it. How does it hit you? Is Dante doing a good job in combining these two things that are rarely combined? In fact, I was trying to think of what other works in literature combine this idea of scholarly treatise on different subjects and poetry. And one that came to mind was Lucretius on the nature of things, which I think he does a pretty good job there of expounding all the different philosophical things, but it's a little different than Dante's project. And so I'm curious what people thought about Dante as a scholar / poet in one. Another thing that I want to do is I was thinking of the geometry of the different cantos. And let me share my screen. I want to show you something. And again, I'm curious about what you think about this. So make this a little bit smaller. Actually, trying to not show you the whole thing. I want to show you. So this first part here is the, can everyone see my screen? Yep. Okay. So this first part, that's Inferno, right? So we start out, we leave the stars, and we start from the larger circle of limbo, and we gradually go around in a circular motion, but we go down to essentially a point, where Lucifer is stuck in frozen state. So everything is completely static. That's where we end up, from the most sort of the widest area to the lowest and the most constricted area. Then we see the stars again, we re-emerge, and we go in the opposite direction, it seems, even though in our idea, a mountain is something that keeps getting narrower as you go up. In the experience, in the narration, it doesn't seem that way. In fact, when we get to the earthly paradise, there are two rivers at the top of the mountain. There are woods, and Dante is trying to follow Matilda, and it seems like they just keep going and going. It's not like they're standing on the peak of a mountain. It just seems like there's enough room there for this huge procession, and there's just so the idea, it seems, that we keep going to a place that is actually wider and wider, and then we end up in this third area, which is actually quite different still. And this is where we're no longer going in straight lines and circles, but we're actually, we're going from spheres to a larger sphere. So we start in earthly paradise, and then we go to the sphere of the moon, and then we instantaneously traverse upwards into the sphere of Mercury, and then the sun. And it keeps going. Of course, I just drew the ones that we've covered so far. But it seems like the motion itself is very different, and the feel is very different from this sort of concentric motion that we've encountered. And perhaps, let me go back to, perhaps, again, I'm just curious if anyone has found it to be similar as you read and think about it. The difference in style and in content and just the nature of the journey compared to Inferno, compared to Purgatory. Okay, so that's the geometrical association that I have in my mind as I was trying to picture it, how the journey is proceeding. Some big themes that come out already out of the first 11 chapters of Paradiso. One big theme, of course, is this relationship between material world and immaterial spiritual world, and the ascendancy, it appears, in Dante's mind of spiritual over material. So remember we talked about the medieval mindset and how it's so different from modern mindset, and how we tend to think that physical phenomena is the foundational phenomena for everything. We are materialists in our outlook, at least most people are. But the medieval mindset was the opposite. You start with spiritual realities and you go from there. So you start from like Pythagoras, you start from numbers and then you go to music, right? The relationships between numbers underlie relationships between the diatonic scale. Or you start with number 4, and then you say, okay, you know what? We can neatly divide the world into 4 substances: air, water, earth, fire. And then you add number 3, and you end up with number 7. So there's this preoccupation with these perfect numbers and relationships. And all of it underlies a very simple assertion that spiritual things actually are fundamental, and the physical things are either a metaphor for spiritual or they are subservient. And the first expression of that is the fact that Dante now floats up into the air, and when he questions Beatrice about it, thinking, well, how come the law of gravity doesn't apply to us anymore? And she says, wait a second, you should be asking how come you were still on the earth, because your soul is attracted to God now that it's perfect, now that it's been cleansed, you have nothing holding you back. And so therefore, the only question you should be asking, how come you're not going faster? Not that how come you are overcoming the law of gravity, which to her is just a transient metaphorical thing. So we see this everywhere with spots on the moon. You know, Dante is trying to creates this question and answer period with the idea that maybe it's a physical phenomenon, or at least that was the speculation. It was physical phenomena that accounted for spots on the moon. And Beatrice's response is, no, that's not physical phenomena. It's a spiritual reality that is expressed in these spots. And so, and the same goes for different stars and their colors and their sizes. And pretty much everything that you see is a metaphor. And so anyway, this idea I also find very intriguing, that physical reality is a metaphor and it's not a foundational idea. The foundational idea is immaterial. So I'm curious what other people think about that. And maybe modern physics, we've gone full circle now, because when you get down to modern physics, we're back to things that, you know, that are really immaterial, right? Quarks and things like that are not really something you can touch and handle, and it's all very interesting there. The idea of influence of stars, astrology, is obviously another big thing that underlies the journey, and I'm curious about what other people thought about this, and how are you satisfied with Dante's explanation for kind of blending the stars' influence and free will and destiny? And there are lots of interesting implications there. So I'm actually curious if anybody has also thought about that. The idea, of course, along the way, Dante refutes this idea that souls are born on stars. And when you die, you go back to the star where you were born. This idea is taken from Plato's Timaeus, which is one of the few works of Plato that Dante had access to. And Dante seems to refute that idea. But of course, this is very interesting as well. This idea of being born on a star and then returning to a star after death, if you're deserving. We must say that, because in Plato's explanation there, if you're not deserving, you get reincarnated. And you're not reincarnated into the same form you were. You get reincarnated as a lower form of life until you figure out what's good for you. So anyway, that's a different conversation there. Let's see. Oh, there's another idea of meritocracy in heaven. So in heaven, everybody is not the same, obviously, because they're placed in different spheres. So what is that all about? How can you be equally blessed and yet be in different spheres? And what do you guys think about this idea of in heaven, there's still inequality. There's still, there's still gradations of people. So anyway, I think these are some of the major themes that I just wanted to point out. And if you guys want to speak up, then just raise your hand and I will try to, and I will try to unmute you and you can speak. Let's see here. So anybody who wants to share something, just raise your hand and Let's see who's first. Doug, do you see anybody? Oh, Madeline.
Madeline wants to.
Yeah, Madeline, go ahead. And then Michael after her.
Okay, I'll start it off. The geometry of the place. I liked the old geometry. I liked the turning and the pivoting and all the very precise physical descriptions. Here, it's more like a jump from one sphere to another. And so much of it is incorporeal, except for some of the descriptions of the optics, that I found it somewhat, it was lacking in the physical descriptions that made it so real in the previous two books. And I got kind of lost in all the theology. I had to do a lot of looking things up. I think it, in a way, it is about how difficult it is to convey the ineffable, how difficult it is to speak in words about an incorporeal experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think, though, he does a good job with his excuses for this difficulty, or making up for it in some other way?
I think he does a good job with his excuses for it. I'm not so sure he makes up for it very well. Maybe later in the book he will, but so far I prefer the Purgatorio. I thought that was truly lovely. This has been, I have to say, Paradise is a little bit dull so far.
Okay, no, that's fair. Michael, you want to? I need to unmute you.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, Dante starts out, of course, and I don't think we wanted to slide over this. He is now going to speak to us of the unspeakable, or not the unspeakable, but the ineffable. All the rules change. Everything we've seen is changing, from the geometry changes that you just saw, where things prior we had an orderly, logical development both through hell and through purgatory. Now things are just this blinding flash of light, and there are big changes here owing to this. You mentioned the rhetorical piece becoming more scholastic. The first few books of this, we're getting a discourse on medieval science, such as it was. And it isn't in the medieval science issue that they didn't, that it's material, it's spiritual versus material. We all start out in the material world, but in the medieval, ancient and medieval mind, there was a tendency to ascribe the causes for what appeared in the material world to spiritual things or immaterial things. That we would say today that, well, they didn't look hard enough at the material, and because you keep looking and you keep finding, reasons for things, and they didn't look. And once you've done that, once you've decided I'm not going to look at material things or the evidence before me, now you're open to all kinds of intellectual speculation, which is what medieval science, from beginning with Aristotle right down to St. Thomas, it imposed on the intellectual world, and this is what Dante is coming out of. And to ask if he's done this okay, it's like, well, did you, do I like that fairy tale or do it not? I mean, that, what he's got a problem, and he knows he has a problem, because he advises us at the beginning. He says, there's some people that shouldn't read this book, that should not follow this path. And the reason is that there are no clear signs. And he talks about how you'd be following a boat in the water, and all of a sudden, you were following the wake and the wake has disappeared and now you don't know where the hell you are. So this is a serious problem for Dante. And you know, he could solve it one way or he could solve it another way. He weaves this really intricate tapestry. I mean, artistically, yeah, it's fabulous. As an explanation for something, not so much. But
Right. Well, yeah, I think the real question is how does he do as a poet, incorporating scientific or physical realities into his poetry? Because I don't think much would change, at least for me, if he were expounding something, astronomy based on the latest from Kepler or Newton.
Yeah.
The question is he doing it well enough to make the poem work? Just like Lucretius.
Yeah. Yeah, because he's consistent within the framework he's chosen.
Right.
And he's using the materials in that world, and he's putting them together in a remarkable way.
Right.
So yeah, he's successful at. So as a poem, it's successful, but it's not as successful as, say, you mentioned him before, Lucretius was pretty successful as on a number of different fronts for his time. And I think Dante isn't quite as successful on the scientific front as Lucretius was, but he has a different set of goals.
Right.
Yeah. Lucretius doesn't get a lot of credit these days, but
Right.
I think maybe we want to look at that again.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Ellison, you want to share with us? And then is Maxine next? Maxine after Ellison.
I feel like, I agree with Madeline that I feel like this section, it seems kind of dull in comparison to the Purgatory and the Inferno, but I also feel like it needed to be that way because you need to feel like, any literature, you can only have this real heightened emotion for so long. And then you need to reach this feeling of catharsis, which is where he, once he gets here. So I feel like it's doing that, but it, I certainly wouldn't want to live in hell, but it's much more fun to read about, I think one of the things I was surprised by was I just didn't expect him to be floating around amongst the planets and the stars. I was very surprised by that. I don't know where I imagined heaven would be, but I didn't think they literally would fly by actual planets. So that was a little surprising to me. And one thing that I was thinking about with his relationship with Beatrice in this section, this morning we, with the Philly group, we did a Zoom on Greek myths, and we were talking about Oedipus. And so I kept thinking of his relationship with Beatrice is sort of reminded me a little bit of Oedipus in a way. And I was thinking, because she's, I guess his lover, but also sort of motherly in a bit, and sort of, she's not telling him what to do. She's very smart, and every smart woman knows you never tell a man what to do. She's presenting him with the choices. So it's sort of like the Robert Frost poem in the woods, where you're like, you have this path or you have this path. So, and she says flat out, God gave you free will, so you get to choose the path. But what I was thinking about is that I think the difference really though between, it was like when I was young and I read Oedipus, I was just disgusted by it. But as I got older, I thought, I don't think it's really that Oedipus, has sex with his mother. I think it's a metaphor. And the metaphor really is that the big difference between the terrace of lust and his relationship with Beatrice is that she cares about him. And so, on lust, it's after somebody who doesn't care about you is just empty and meaningless. And the whole reason that this winds up in heaven is because it's, there's love, there's friendship, there's lust, and there's caring. And she cares about him enough to say, look, you could make this choice. So throughout it, I think it makes perfect sense to have her as the guide for this last part, because it's like he's finally reached it, so it should be with her. But I just think that comparison between how she interacts with him versus, the terrors of lust just shows the difference.
Some interesting comments. Maybe I'll share later about this. But Maxine, you wanna give us your thoughts? Oh, you're muted, Maxine. If you could unmute.
I didn't find this boring, but I did find it a bit confusing because I was also in the morning Greek mythology meetup. And it seems as if Dante did kind of borrow from Greek mythology. But the thing that confused me was there he is with Beatrice, and she is his love. And all of a sudden, we're with Francis of Assisi. I mean, he could have kind of eased more gently into that, because it was so quick that you're thinking, what? So how do you interpret that? All of a sudden we're into religion. Love just went out the window, and we're into religion, and it's just mind-boggling. Perhaps you didn't want to read about religion, you want to read about love. Do I skip that part and go on to the one afterward? I mean, how do you interpret that?
Right. Well, that's a good question for our question and answer period. So let's keep that one on the table. Does anyone else want to comment or share their thoughts, their impressions from reading the first 11 chapters of Paradise?
Maxine, could you write that question in the chat section so we don't forget it?
Yeah, that'd be great, Maxine.
Not sure I can do that, but I'll try.
Well, I'm not sure I heard the question, which is why I mean, it's a really interesting topic you brought up, but I'm not sure I heard the question.
Well,
so.
Maxine, was it essentially the relationship between religion and love in the poem? Was that a good way to summarize it?
Good
and how he
question.
jumps between one topic and the other, maybe romantic love and something like asceticism of Franciscan order.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden, everything kind of falls apart, because in religion, you have your original sin and you go from there. But Dante takes you down before he takes you up. Whereas in religion, you're there already and just go up. You don't go down first. I mean, no one is pushing you toward hell. You probably are born in hell. You don't start out of hell, go down to hell, come out.
Yeah, Dante, I think, probably would disagree with you on that. But anyway, all right. David, you want to share with us your thoughts?
Yeah, I was curious where he was going to go after we're sort of letting go of reason and saying, yeah, we're going to get truth and understanding, having, in what way, abandoned reason, because reason is this highest, almost divine aspect of our, relationship to the universe, and divinity is light, which is it's more reason and understanding. But so I'm sort of looking for how many ways we take in truths that aren't through our reason, or if they are, why maybe they're not developed through reason, we're just giving them through some kind of grace or something. But and he answers a lot of questions, but I haven't really got his scheme in my head. It's so many things at once came in these 11 sections. But you have to buy into this idea of how spoiled and how fundamentally sin-based human life is. And that I have the problem there with that one, that we have to start out seeing ourselves as is some way starting corrupt, as opposed to potential starting as already corrupt. I sort of like that. I kind of don't. I wonder how people reconcile that when they read this.
Just to be clear, when you talk about abandonment of reason, you basically you're referring to a couple of places where Dante is talking about how this is so transcendental and so beyond sort of human capacity to logically put together. Is that what you were getting at?
He doesn't get the answers on his own at all. And he's all told, well, you could go experiment, but I don't even think he would get the answers. He has to be given these.
Right. So it's like revelation.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's a good point, because especially in all of Commedia, and actually everywhere, Dante, even from La Vita Nuova, there is this premium placed on intellect. He values it highly. So that is a really interesting observation about how do you reconcile. And this actually, I mean, I tend to have the same problem with some of the tenets of Christianity, where in one side you're asked to engage the whole person, intellect, emotion, will, everything. But on the other side, you kind of conveniently say, you know what, that part, that's beyond you. So just turn it off. Just turn off your intellect at this point. And that is a sticky point.
Well, he doesn't really seem to avoid it, but I'm not sure I get his point.
Yeah, that's
He
good.
he goes to where there's the conflict of what you think is moral and the conflict of what's being done, and he says, "I see harmony because I like somehow put it together, even though it seems contradictory."
Interesting. And does anyone else have any thoughts? If not, then I'll let Doug. Maybe Michael. Maybe I'll let someone else who hasn't spoken yet. Do we have anybody else? All right. Well, Michael, go ahead and then we'll let Doug present his thoughts on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on the reason on the intellect takes intellect, like all other human capacities, actually fail once you've gone into the spiritual world of the Paradiso. And that's one of the reasons that Dante is concerned about people reading this book, because if you relied on the old tools, it isn't, they've gotten you so far, but now it's a different game and everything changes. So it's not like he doesn't say there's no value to the intellect. It's just that it's outlived its time, as it were.
Right. No, that's also actually a good point. In fact, I've read some commentaries on that passage that you're referring to, where he talks about, you know what, maybe you should even turn back, unless you're specifically prepared by, I think he talks about the manna. I think talking about basically, if you're not part of the sacraments, if you're not part of the Christian family, then you don't have the tools required to proceed on this journey. Because you will try to, like we're talking about, reason it all out, and it's beyond reason at this point. So yeah, there is that, but it is still, I still think that for Dante to make that kind of leap and make it so lackadaisically in a way is somewhat unusual, because he is extremely intellectual person, and also Thomas Aquinas, whom he follows and whom we meet in the sphere of the sun, is an intellectual of first order, and encyclopedic type of intellectual, who has a breadth that seems unimaginable to us. So to dispense with rationality so quickly and so easily is a big move. All right, I'm gonna let Doug take over at this point. Doug, you want to share with us?
Yeah, I have one question before I share, because what I was going to share actually touches base on a lot of things people have raised. But where does he abandon rationality?
He doesn't say he abandons it, but he does warn people, number one, that what he's about to disclose cannot be comprehended with reason alone. So it requires.
Oh, right. Okay, now I remember. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that leads into what I wanted
And
to
then
say.
he actually encourages people to turn back and not follow him along, unless they've tasted of the angelic manna or something along those lines.
Right. Now I remember it. I was saying, that it's sort of what David said. There's so much in the Paradiso that your brains fall out at some point. You just sort of like lose track of it. So what I've been trying to do is go back, finish it a week early, and then spend a week just reviewing all of it in a more condensed period. And that's when my brain really starts to explode. But I've come up with 2 or 3 things, and 3 cantos really pop out for me. And I don't think he abandons reason. He does say words can't do this. And then he calls on Apollo, who is the god of reason, to help him do it. And he says, I'm going to call on the muses as well, but he in fact abandons the muses. He almost abandons metaphor altogether, which is why we're all having this sort of feeling that it's very dry and not very physical. And then it gets kind of interesting. But Canto II, I just got furious with Canto II. So much so, if I'm that mad at it, I have to read it over and over and over again, and 2 or 3 different translations. And what I finally came up with is, after he's descended through hell at the instigation of his beloved, then climbed the mountain, which is a muscular act, the descending and the climbing down and the crawling up. And, he finally gets to heaven, and there's Beatrice. And in Canto II, they basically have a study date, and it's almost like they're 9-year-olds, and the girl is brighter than the boy and rubbing it in, saying, I'm revealing to you the truths that I know from God because I'm close to God. And it's like, and once I did that, I said, this is either really bad Saturday Night Live or really good Monty Python, because they're both arguing scientific principles that are wrong. I mean, why is the moon modeled? And they're proud they're not going back to the folklore of Cain, right? But they know it's like it's density or thinness or density. No, it's qualities. It's not just density. And they're both wrong because we don't have the telescope, and Galileo hasn't determined that they're mountains, right? Which I think, given Dante's obsession with mountains and valleys, he would go to a whole nother level of metaphors when we go to the moon in the canto, but he's just dead wrong. They're both dead wrong. And she's so proud that she's revealing the truth to him. And there's a lot of that. I reveal to you, I will tell you. And there's none of the struggle of back and forth questioning and dialectic, where it is mother-child or big sister, little brother, compared to the middle-aged man and the older man really trying to figure out what hell and purgatory are about. I mean, it's like we almost go infantile with the beginning of Paradise. But once you get beyond that, it's very interesting. It is in fact, it's almost like he's predicted the structure of quantum mechanics, because the leaps are instantaneous. From the time you raise your head from the ground to heaven, you've moved to a totally different sphere. So there's something really interesting, but it's also like he stops being Fellini, he stops being the other great Italian directors, Rossellini, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And it's like he becomes Peter Greenaway. It's very Apollonian as opposed to Dionysian or feminine. And apparently the oracle at Delphi would be during the summer, spring months would be, or I don't know which months, but during the summer, basically, it was Apollo's temple. But during the winter, it was Dionysus's temple. And so the darker forces took over in the winter. And so Dante kind of abandons the body and the wisdom that comes from the body, which you mentioned, Phil. And I think that's why I was so furious with it for a while. It was like, this is just so dry. The cantos that come alive are Canto VI and Canto XI for me. And, if I could show you, I'll show you just one of them. That's when I began to really write like my father in law books. We all grew up watching my father scribble in law books. So if you can see that, it's a very dense thing of circling and writing. And so both Canto VI and Canto XI have these really dense red scribbles. And Canto VI is the eagle. That is the metaphor. And these are like fairy tales. The eagle, I've worked on a couple of projects where I've discovered this, like in the Oedipus plays, basically, Thebes, there was a Thebes in Egypt. So I began to think of the legacy of Egypt going to Greece. And Thebes is where Oedipus is. So that's inheriting the Egyptian Thebes, the culture there, and then it gets inherited, and then it goes to Troy and they defeat Troy, and then the Trojans go to Rome. And so the eagle, he doesn't go back to Egypt so much, but he does pick up the journey of the eagle of empire, which is actually a divine thing. Most of the time people are using it and they're misusing it. But that tracking of the eagle that goes from really Egypt in a way, the more powerful nation, although not as predatory as Greece and Rome maybe, but Greece, and then it goes to Troy, and then Troy inherits the eagle, but it has to go to Carthage, and then it has to go to Rome, and then it goes back to Constantinople, and then it goes back to Rome, and then it goes to maybe the German states. And if you go to Shakespeare's Cymbeline, he makes it very clear that there is an important dream where the eagle flies north to Britain. And they don't know what that dream means, and it's interpreted various ways, like the Romans will succeed. But in fact, what Shakespeare is saying is the Romans have to merge with the British people for the empire to continue. And then if you look at the symbolism of the Russian coat of arms and the United States coat of arms, they all have eagles. So I did a project on the Oedipus trilogy as TV talk show and court TV and deathbed interview with Ismene as to how Oedipus really died. We did the whole play as kind of a TV show thing. And at one point, Ismene asks the question, where will the eagle fly next in the play? We kind of threw that in, and it may or may not have been a line. But definitely when Oedipus gives his bones to Athens and not to Thebes, that empowers Athens. And Oedipus is a hero because he pursues the truth even though it costs him the kingdom. Creon protects his kingdom and sort of, he will do anything to preserve his power. He's not thinking of the good of the kingdom. Oedipus is out to cure the plague. And there's been blood that has been spilled and not acknowledged. And he pursues that relentlessly, even when he's the victim of that pursuit. And that's what makes him a hero. And I was talking to Ellen Stewart at La Mama. And so I think that's important here. What is the hero? It's not always the most powerful person. It's that weak sinner who's willing to sacrifice all the power he has to help the kingdom. And that, I think Dante's picking that up in some way. And so the other, but I think the interesting things are, and then the other 11, the metaphor is the love story. The love story between Francis and Lady Poverty. So his pursuit of the beloved is the pursuit of poverty, which is what Jesus told rich people to do. Give away all your money and follow me. And Francis does that. The other odd thing about Francis is that he's the son of a wool merchant, and wool is a very powerful symbol in Sufism. You know, the weaving of wool and the wool garment, and it's sort of a symbol for teachings. And so that's kind of interesting that Francis's father was a wool merchant. So I'm just throwing out a couple of things, like if I were directing this piece, and then I analyzed it, I started to make a storyboard to sort of, if my head was going to fall off with this, I said it should fall on paper. So I got a sketchbook, and every spread will be kind of covering a canto, each spread in the thing. So I just went through the section on, trying to think which is the one I worked on the most. Yeah, these are the notes for 11, Canto 11, the love story. I mean, the amount of information he's packing into Canto 11 is ferocious. And so unless I storyboard it and say, which for theater people, it's like you take every beat and unit and every shift in character and you analyze the actions of each character, see how they interlace, and then all the references. I mean, this kind of thing Phil does with the amazing charts he does, which allow me to see through lines. So you look at all the actions and objectives, and then you say, can you define a super objective here? And so that's what I'm trying to do with Dante. There are all these little actions, but do they add up to a super action? What's the super action, the through line? what actors and directors call the through line of the play, the energy that keeps an audience actually engaged in the movie or in the play. And so I guess I'll stop it there. I might put some posts on some movies. Oh, there's one other important thing I want to mention because of the movement. And the movement is much subtler and instantaneous and quick. But there is an interesting movement, but it's took me so long to tune into it. And it has to do with, there's a great Russian teacher, which I've mentioned before, an acting teacher, a student of Stanislavski's. He was called Michael Chekhov, the nephew of Anton Chekhov, the playwright. And he really analyzed what the actor does, the how of what the actor does. I mean, there is the thing the actor does, but then the how he does it is the other important thing for Michael Chekhov. And he tied that to the four elements, which keep coming up in Dante. So with earth, it's a molding action. It's very muscular. You know, with water, it's a floating action. So an actor may really mold something in one scene, but then float on the water of another scene. And then flying, you do an air. And flying is a mix of muscular, you float on, glide on the air, but there's also a lot of muscularity if you watch birds work. There's a mix of muscle and floating, you know, muscle and exertion and relaxation. Then the fourth element is fire, and that's, in Michael Chekhov's terms, radiating. And the word radiation and radiating, and for Michael Chekhov, that was the fact that an actor could convey something to an audience without physically doing anything. And I've actually seen this happen on stage, where there's a point in the play about Buckminster Fuller where Bucky actually kind of dies. He's talking about his wife, and he says, "Are we supposed to die at the same time?" Maybe so. And then he closes his eyes, something very mysterious. And he makes a weird comment and he closes his eyes. And then it goes into the end of the play. Well, I was working with Joe Spano, the actor was on Hill Street Blues doing the play, and I threw out the idea that maybe he dies there. And Joe would go absolutely silent and still at that moment. And I actually had an audience member come up from the audience and say, "Is that the point where Bucky dies?" And Joe wasn't doing anything. He was just being still and radiating a certain energy or lack of energy. Maybe he just withdrew his energy from the audience, which actors can do. And Pina Bausch's dance theater work, if you've seen Pina, that's an amazing movie of what psychologically dancers can convey through their athleticism. So the love story, though, is important because Lady Poverty climbs up on the cross with Christ, her beloved. And they are bound and constant. I wanted to come back to the other idea that Phil mentioned of the seal and the wax, and that starts popping up almost in every canto. There's some impression, some sealing, to the point where you realize the nails in the palms of the hand is a form of sealing him to humanity. You know, he's nailed to the cross, and he even uses the word sealing. The final sealing he uses when Francis dies, and it's also there when Christ dies on the cross. So Canto 11 has so many astonishing things packed in there. The only other thing I would mention is some movies, and I'll just post the titles. Rossellini did a movie called The Flowers of St. Francis, and he actually used monks to make the movie. There's only one actor in the film, and he's over the top and overacting, but the movie itself is really lovely. It's called The Flowers of St. Francis by Roberto Rossellini, Isabella Rossellini's father, who was married to Ingrid Bergman, and he's an amazing filmmaker. The other thing I would mention, and it might be interesting here to see the themes of what the Italians have maybe picked up from Dante, is Martin Scorsese's movie about my voyage to Italy, or my voyages to Italy. I can't remember what it's called. I have it, I'll write it down. And it's where he describes watching these Italian movies in Little Italy in New York City when he was a little boy and his family only spoke Italian. So some of the interplay of light and dark shows up a lot in Martin Scorsese's films. And I'll put a couple of titles that I think are particularly relevant about journeying into hell and then out to something else. You know, even in Mean Streets, Robert De Niro kind of goes to the light of the police who are going to either arrest him or kill him. And then I think the other character is saved with his girlfriend. So there's this weird kind of lover, beloved, friend, partner. They're best buds, but they come to this dividing point. So I'll put a couple of titles there. I think that's it. That's sort of the...
All right. Well, thank you. That was very interesting, and definitely lots to digest there. Does anyone else have any comments based on anything that has been said so far, or maybe you have thought of something else you want to add? If you do, then raise your hand. Madeline, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a question for Doug. I was really fascinated, as I've been before, at the way that you read Dante's poem as if it were a play and analyze it like that. Do you see like a mini 3-act structure in each canto, or do you see it over the course of a book, or how do you see the underlying structure of the whole thing? If you were thinking about it as a play or any kind of narrative drama, really, the underlying narrative structure?
Well, that's a really good question. And in each book, I'll have to think about that. I'm not sure I have a quick answer. But from the 3 books, there are a lot of movie scripts that descend into hell. Then there's a period of struggle in Act 2. And then there's a crisis between Act 2 and 3. And then it either goes back to hell or descends to a happy ending, you know. So there is in the basic Hollywood 3-act structure. And Fellini, I think I mentioned this briefly before, the first movie Fellini saw as a child was a silent movie of the Divine Comedy. So his filmmaking is apparently, I haven't tracked this down in detail. I just discovered this recently, that Federico Fellini's the movie he saw as a kid was the Divine Comedy. And a fairly famous Italian silent version, which I haven't seen. I've seen scenes of it, I think about 20, 30 years ago. But I mean, that's what I'm trying to do, and breaking it down to what they call 3x5 cards, or a storyboard that my teacher at Cal Arts used to teach film writing from storyboards. And you can draw them out or you can write them out. Then that's sort of the technique, you know, that I'm using, is where are the characters? By Canto, by the 3rd thing, it's like Dante doesn't even have to ask. They read his mind and tell him the answers to his questions. So that's a very interesting kind of dramaturgy there, but it's very different. It's not like he has to formally ask. They read his mind and answer his question. So I'm trying to break it down into the little cards and then see what and then when you can have hundreds of cards and you spread them on a big table, and then you can begin to sort of move the story around. And that's what Hollywood writers do. They put it all down on cards, and then if they have a problem with the script when they're shooting it, they start shuffling the cards around. The beats and units is what it's called. And they, you know, occasionally I've taken a deck of storyboard cards and just shuffled them and then put them out at random. And then you realize completely different ties. One of the experimental directors who directed Christmas Carol. Well, Christmas Carol very much goes through a Dantean journey. You know, he goes through the grief of loss of his sister in the past. He's melted to tears, and he's reformed into a new man who can celebrate and party and appreciate and care for the poor and the fellow travelers. And then they scare the hell out of him by, in a sense, taking him to the death stave to make him remember these lessons. And then when he survives, he enters a state of ecstasy at the end of Christmas Carol. And so that's a 5-act structure of the frozen man who's melted down, rebuilt into a new man, goes through a kind of trial by fire to forge that new man into something solid, a sword that's not going to break. That's what the state 4 does. You know, a fear unto death that makes you remember. And then he survives that and he goes into a state of ecstasy. So Christmas Carol is a simple story. It's deceptively simple. You know, it actually tracks the mystical journey.
All right. So unless there are any other parting thoughts, we're going to go into breakout rooms. Oh, David, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I could add something. Just a little. It was at the beginning of your discussion, Doug. You were saying that something about his science was all messed up, and I don't know. That was, I guess, about Canto II, explaining the moon, explaining the lighting of things. I mean, it's all mystical stuff. So Beatrice, she excludes two standing versions of scientific explanation. She rules them out and says, no, you don't get it. The science of light is really much more subtle, and it has to do with the power of the unity of nature being this infinite idea, you know, which is the same everywhere. And it's sort of like, it's a little vague, but it's sort of, there's nothing wrong with what she says in any kind of way as a scientific theory. It's just, you know, yeah, there are unified forces in the world. The whole universe works the same way, and you see light because, you know, light behaves in different ways depending on what it's interacting with, and everything has its own energy, and that's its color, and that's exactly right. I couldn't say it better. You know, so it's sort of so vague it can't be wrong, right?
It actually, I totally agree with you. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it because I don't think that's his thrust. But Dante is just dealing with the latest, quote, science of his day. Whatever, if he had known about Darwinian evolution and Newtonian physics and Einstein, he would have been using that. So I don't think we need to get hung up on whether or not he was correct in describing the universe. He is using the universe as his stage for concepts, and he's using however he wants to use it. He's a poet. So the latest science of that day was Ptolemaic universe with epicycles, with very precise predictions. So it was actually a scientific theory because it had the power of predicting different things. It just wasn't very simple. It wasn't very accurate. You could still use Ptolemaic predictions to say which planet is going to be where at what point in time. It's just going to be off by slightest, and you have to keep constantly updating it because it's a complicated system, because you choose a wrong reference point. You choose Earth as the point of reference for everything else. Once you pick the sun as the reference point for everything else, and you depart from perfect circles as the orbits, and you end up with elliptic orbits, it becomes actually much easier to predict. Now, the question that everybody wanted to know when Copernicus and Galileo took the main stage was, is this just another model, just as good as a Ptolemaic model, or is this actually reality? And today, our assertion is, no, this is actually reality. This is how actually the world works. The Earth is not stationary. Even though you could say, we have relativity in physics, so you could pick any point really as your reference point in physics. But we do believe that there is something more real about the sun being the focal point of our solar system, not the Earth. However, that's, again, if Dante knew that, he would have been using that, I'm pretty sure, as his skeleton for his journey.
Right, so his E-Day fix or whatever, that no matter what science you put in front of him, it's going to fit into this thing. And that's why my question was, to what degree are we concerned with the distinction between metaphors as explanations and what's a reality as explanation? Or has he really said, I can put this together somehow, and what you need to know, it doesn't matter what those details are, I have a structure that contains it all somehow?
No, I tend to
think that's an important
metaphors are right.
qualification. David, that's a really important qualification of what I said. I think that's an important point, and I agree with you completely. And I mean, that it's not as simple. That was my just getting angry at Dante and Canto II, and I had to wrestle it into the ground and make my peace with it. But it's, in fact, there's a history of science from the teaching company. It's like 18 CDs, and at some point in medieval science, there's some breakthrough that reaches back 200 years to an obsolete theological idea to make a scientific breakthrough. So I think it's very complex. So on a metaphor level, it almost like it anticipates quantum physics by being wrong about medieval physics.
Yeah, I think people dismiss the complexity of medieval science. They think it was just hogwash, but it wasn't. It was actually anything but. It was quite complicated.
Yeah.
And quite detailed. Madeline,
thank you, David. I think that was good.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. Madeline, do you want to say something?
Yes, this actually relates to what David said about metaphor and science. Procession of the Equinoxes, which is the axial wobble of the Earth. And so over a 26,000 year cycle, the stars will change position in the sky. That was actually postulated more than once in ancient China. Hipparchus, who was an Egyptian in the Greek Empire, I believe, he got all the records from ancient Babylonia and compiled them and saw that the stars changed position in the sky. However, the problem was that in order for that to work, the sun would have to be the center and the circles couldn't be exact. And he had to abandon it because it wasn't the prevailing mental model of the time. It wasn't the metaphor for how the world worked. So there are things that have been thought of and abandoned over and over and over again that have recently been verified. I hate to think that they will be dropped again and rediscovered, but we never know.
Exactly.
I would say cognitive dissonance in Galileo's time was getting hit over the head by a heavy hammer because you disagreed with people.
Actually, what I'd read was that the church's problem with Galileo, it wasn't his theory, it was that he insisted on stating it as fact.
Yeah.
And they wanted him to introduce it more gradually. So they weren't an unsophisticated bunch. Like those Jesuits, they were pretty smart. They could see that he was right, but they felt that it was basically that it was so disruptive that it was better to state it as theory and keep it as a theory rather than to state it as a fact about the world.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I wanted to also mention another writer who talks about the difference between the two. Owen Barfield, if you guys know him, he wrote several very interesting books about that. One is called Saving the Appearances. And there he's talking about the difference between what we experience, things like sunrise and sunset, versus how we explain it, the model for explaining it. And the fact is that you can come up with any number of models that explain the appearances. The question is which one of them is more real, or if any of them are in fact real. And that goes back to this idea that all the appearances themselves are a metaphor for something underlying that's deeper than the appearances. And that is actually something that goes back all the way to Aristotle and even philosophers before him, where they just essentially said things that are changing cannot be fundamental because they are changing. They have to be reflections of something idealized. This is where you get into Plato's, forms and the theory of forms and ideas and so forth. But Dante, I think he follows that logic. And so when we talk about spots on the moon, I don't know if he really thought that, it was because there are certain intelligences associated with the moon, the angels and so forth, and because of their nature that is changeable and fickle and so forth, that you have this sort of differences in light and dark, or whether he thought it was actually really like some physical phenomena. Yeah, I think it doesn't matter. I think the point is, again, how he's using it to make his point about two things. One is there are certain influences that are coming from above that we can't explain. Basically the unknowable, about the random maybe in our lives. And we're going to assign that part of our lives to the stars, their influences on us. The second one is our nature. And the third part is our free will, which kind of navigates us between these two things that are kind of fixed that we cannot change. We can't change our nature, we can't change the influence of the stars, but we still have free will, which is what we're responsible for, essentially. And he keeps coming back to that, because that is the only thing that makes sense in a universe that you can't explain. Otherwise, you can just sort of, hang it up and say we're all living in a dream. But he doesn't do that. He decides to actually navigate it as a poet and as a sort of philosopher. Okay, we're going to go into our breakout rooms. Okay, so we're back from the breakout rooms. I hope everyone enjoyed it. We had a lively discussion. Doug, did you guys do the same? Doug, you're muted.
I'm not sure how that happened. We had a great discussion. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent.
You could see it on the smiles in faces or the
yes,
or confused looks too.
Confused looks, right, right. So what we want to do now is what we've come to call the lightning round, which is we're going to record any kind of questions you have about what we've read so far. We're going to record these questions, and then we're going to go back and try to answer them collectively together. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat, and then we will try to go back and deal with it, answer it. So far, just a reminder, so far we have 2 questions, and maybe we've answered them to some degree, but maybe we can expand further. So one question is this idea that Paradiso is not as big on rationality and rational discourse as the other 2 cantos. And what you guys think about that? Does Dante really abandon reason in some way? Does he place lesser premium on it? A second question has to do with this idea of tension between love and religion. So on one hand, we have this extreme asceticism as embodied by Francis of Assisi. And on the other side, we have, different sphere of Venus, and we have Kunitsa, and we have some of these other characters that seem to enjoy love at its fullest. How do we reconcile religion and love, and are the 2 really opposite? I mean, I'm adding at this point some of my own interpretation here. So anyway, anything on that is, those are the 2 questions we have so far. And then if you have any other questions, go ahead, type them in, and then we will try to deal with them. If nobody has any questions, then I guess we can start with everybody knows everything perfectly. Okay.
I typed a question. Wait a minute. Did I send somebody my question? I sent a question in.
Write it in the chat.
Yeah, right in the chat, and then we can address it hopefully together.
Yeah,
Or just state it verbally, and somebody else can write it in the chat.
I thought I wrote it.
Yeah,
Yes, I had a question about Dante's not having a body, whereas it seemed very important in the other books.
Okay, the role of the body. Okay.
He was recognized as being alive, and
That's actually a really good topic. Thank you, Dave, for bringing that up. I wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, can I just add an element to that, which is that the topic of the shadow, they were always commenting on, in the other books, it's, ooh, you have a shadow. Oh, look, he has a shadow.
Right.
But I don't recall seeing that in here.
Okay. Added. Okay.
Well, actually, he does have a body, and the souls in Paradiso know exactly that he has a body. In fact, because he has a body, they have to manifest themselves in a way that is his sensible, poor little eyes can see. They are nothing. What he describes is nothing of what the Paradiso is, nothing. But that's all because he has a body, that's all he can see. So they condescend to look like light or to look like this. And the best ways in which they show their joy is by dancing and by the singing. and brightness. Because he has a body, they condescend.
Okay.
Like that word condescende. I like that.
Right. So we're saying his body is not mentioned, but it's implied by the reaction of the celestial beings that he encounters.
You wanted to know about the spheres, how many spheres there were. That came up in our meeting.
Okay. Okay. Let's put that down. How many spheres are there? All right. Okay. Anyone else?
Just one more thing about the body. When we reach the last canto in Paradiso, where he sees the beatific sight, the face of God, or he tries to see the face of God, his mind is blown. He cannot talk, but his body remembers, because he feels this sweetness engulf him. His body remembers, not his memory and not his mind.
Interesting. Interesting. I'll need to reread that part. That's, of course, that's the central part of the canto. Okay. Anyone else? Questions for discussion?
I have a question. The very final note, when Dante reaches the end of his vision and he's granted the sight of the universe, just your interpretation, or everyone's interpretation of seeing what he's seen.
Well, you're jumping a little bit ahead. We might answer that. It is a little bit cheating because you're jumping ahead of us.
Okay.
We haven't gotten there yet.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
But maybe we'll answer it. I want to keep the suspense. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Right.
We want to. All right. Anyone else?
No spoilers.
Yeah. You don't want to spoil it.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, we can write this down. Remember for the next time or the one after that.
Okay.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. Well, let's go back. Maybe some more questions will come up as we discuss these. So the first one was about this relationship to reason, the role of reason in paradise in this whole discussion. Do you feel like there's a lessening of its role, and why? And do you think it's justified? Anything about that? Is there, who wants to take that one? Just write an exclamation point or raise a hand, either way.
Could you read that again, please? Sorry.
So the role of reason in paradise, is it different than the other cantos? If so, why? Do you think it's justified? Do you think that there is less of emphasis on being able to work things out using the rational part of a human being, which seems to be so important to Dante in general, as an ethical organ, if you will? So anyone wants to take that?
Yeah.
Okay, David, go ahead.
I'll start there, because to start it, it's not totally satisfying, but in Canto 4, when he's talking about this subtle distinction between having made a vow and not fulfilled it because you're forced not to fulfill it, then it's this kind of reasoning distinction. It's a Jesuit, but you're doing the right thing, but you were made not to do the right thing. How much is it your fault? You had free will, but you didn't have free will over that. And how much did you go along with it? And this is really slicing the bologna. So, but it's
Really what? I missed that. Really what?
Slicing the bologna.
Oh, bologna.
slicing the bologna. Yeah, no matter how you can slice it, it's the bologna. But it's like rational, and cut. So, I mean, he's using the reason all the time, but he wasn't able to figure. So, Beatrice is walking him through. So he hasn't abandoned reason, but it's not, and he can't forsake it. He has to really, really use that muscle. But somehow, I don't know, is love the real motive? I'm not sure. I mean,
Doug, do you want to take that?
Yeah, something Isabel said, her mic is actually off. She may have been trying to join in our group, was that, Beatrice drives this. And I think love is the driving force. But as we'll see maybe in the next Canto 12, there's the steersman. So there's St. Francis, who's love, and then there's Dominic, or do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I'm losing track of my tongue and my brain. And that's the steersman. There's the reason. It's sort of like Krishna's the steersman for Arjuna's chariot. There's Bucky talked about the phantom captain. So there's that thing that chooses, and Dominique seems to be that. But the force, the wind that drives the boat, and they're described as the two, not passengers. I'll find it.
Souls, is it?
They're called the two passengers or pilots of St. Peter's boat. Francis, it's like the head and the heart, and the wisdom. And so we get then to the philosophia, love of wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. And so you're dealing with these, you need two hands to paddle kind of thing, or 2 feet to walk, I think. I'll leave it at that. I think that's.
Anyone else jump in here on this question? Let's see. Okay, no one. I just wanted to mention one thing though, and this just kind of came to me as we were talking. So there's definitely a lot more scholastic rationality in Paradiso than we've encountered before. A lot of these arguments are exactly the kinds of arguments that took place in the universities of Paris, and some of these other learning institutions where Dante probably maybe even took part in them. The types of arguments, the types of syllogisms that are used in what you call slicing the bologna, David. I mean, it's precisely that kind of logical chain of reasoning. Maybe it starts out with a wrong premise and then the whole thing is flawed, but that's the scheme. So I guess I don't see it, even though Dante does give us some warnings about having to be enlightened and having to have revelation and having to have this divine inspiration to guide his vessel and to guide our vessel as we follow him. There's definitely still overt reliance on our faculty of following the reasoning, whether it's talking about the spots on the moon, whether it's talking about why we can ascend from one sphere to the next, or really anything. I mean, it's all really contingent on rationality. So it seems to me that maybe this thesis that rationality is not very valued in Paradiso, maybe it's not accurate, because it is. Scholasticism was very much a rational endeavor. Okay, let's go to the question 2, which is religion versus love. So I'm sure everyone will want to chime in on that. Raise your hand or type an exclamation point in the chat. Don't be shy.
Well, very briefly, I looked up religion, and it's like a bonding, or, bound to, which is like an order, but the lover wants to be bound to the beloved, and there's often separation. But so that's, and I think you practice with an earthly lover to find God or something, which you move beyond or through the beloved to a higher love. That's common in Sufi thinking and mystical thinking, Christian, Islamic, Jewish.
Okay.
Also, there's a critique of religion in its organization and institutional incarnation, that it's always flawed. The body of religion seems to constantly decay, and the popes and everyone is called to task. So something about the religion that's its spirit and its love, we have to distinguish that from what in your question. Like love may be the essence of the binding that is true religion.
Right. Well, it's like the hippie love is God type of a motto, right?
There you go.
All you need is love. Yeah.
Yeah, all you need is love. Exactly. Anyone else want to chime in? with their thoughts on this.
He's been critical of institutional religion as throughout. I mean, from the very beginning. So that's not. So that has never. He's never felt that the institute, that religion as it has evolved as a human institution, serves the purposes of spiritual formation, and it actually in many cases is just the opposite. So, and certainly love has fallen out of favor in the institutional church.
What about in Dante's mind? Do you think there's a tension between religion?
Oh, clear. Well, you know, that I think at this point we're no longer talking about religion. We're talking about the spiritual motive, the spirituality, and I'm not sure that I'm not, and certainly there's a connection between love and that. But I'm not. I think religion is at this point takes on a different guise than it had before. So it may not be that this is a good opposition in Paradiso, religion versus love.
Right. Well, just for context, I think when Maxine raised that question, she was specifically referring to the canto about Francis and his marriage, symbolic marriage to poverty as his mistress. Right. And so I guess the question, you know, Maxine, maybe you can expand on that or correct me. I think the question was more about how do you reconcile this, on one side, this asceticism that is prevalent in these different monastic orders and this extreme renunciation of everything to marry an abstract concept, really, poverty, right? Versus some of these other saints, and maybe even Dante and Beatrice himself, the troubadours. We have quite a few characters mentioned here in this canto, the cantos before Kunitsa and some of the others that were basically marrying off and jumping from one affair to another, and yet they're in heaven. How do we put it all together? How does it make sense, or does it make sense?
We're talking about the same thing. We're always talking about love. Even in hell, there's love all over, but it's love misdirected. It's love too much. It's love used the wrong way, but it's always love. The spark of love is all through the universe, all the Purgatorio, Paradiso, and Inferno. And so there is no difference. The love that he has for Beatrice is a ray of this divine love that shines all over. And he chooses to see Povertà as a woman. Remember, St. Francis also chose to see death as our sister. Remember in his canticle, the son, my brother, and St. Francis chose to see death as our sister, but only towards the end did he recognize that death is our sister. But so Dante sees Povertà, or sees St. Francis see Povertà as love, and he fell in love with her, a woman, a beautiful woman, just like Dante falls in love with Beatrice. It's hard to say. I guess it's the same, but to me, it's the same thing. Love is love. And the problem is today, love has become so commonplace. The currency is so cheap. We no longer recognize. And that's what's important to read the Commedia, because it gives us the brilliance of what it really is.
Thank you, Isabel. This is actually very, very good. I was wondering if I can paraphrase it in some way to say that love is it's like a dimension almost, and we're all somewhere in this space, just in different places. And there's sort of like there's a sweet spot, I guess, where this love is directed and balanced, and we all we need to try to get into that sweet spot. And maybe Dante's journey is a metaphor for getting into that sweet spot where you have, again, love is directed at the right person or persons, whether it's God and people that surround you and so forth. And it's balanced in this way, and it's appropriate. And then all these other stories are really stories of where you've gone astray in this space of potential placements, and you need to find your way back to the sweet spot somehow. Is that a good or accurate paraphrase?
You know, in the beginning of this whole thing, we had to deal with the ugly person that he loved better than the other person. We didn't start it. Remember, there was an ugly person that I guess he was talking about his wife. I don't know who, but that was one kind of love. And he said that that was very important to him. He didn't care about beauty. He cared about something deeper. But then that person disappeared. Every time he had a true love come in, they disappeared into thin air, and you got something else put in front of you. So that's what was so confusing.
Does anybody want to comment on that? Yeah, Doug?
There's another thing I wanted to comment, that I think Francis is the founder of a barefoot running team, basically, which is very popular today. The idea that you should run trails barefoot, so there's nothing, your actually feet adjust to the ground more subtly, and it's healthier for you to run barefoot than not. And so he does have that sort of poverty, whereas the popes have these Nike's worth thousands of dollars, I think, and they're distanced from the earth. That may sound silly, but I think that is what he's talking about. What brings you down to the earth and the poor, and he does that. He talks about, he names them. He said Bernard's the first runner, then Giles, then Sylvester, and he names the team of barefoot runners.
Madeline, do you want to comment?
Yeah, this is a comment on what Maxine said about loving someone ugly or loving someone beautiful. In the Middle Ages and in other places and times, and possibly even now, back then it really was thought that the exterior was a reflection of the interior. And so, like, say, people with leprosy, which we now understand to be a bacterial disease, were regarded as people with diseased souls that were manifested on the outside. So part of the horror at them was not just the physical fear of the basic mammalian biology of this one of my kind looks different and therefore is a threat, but also some sense that there was something wrong with their soul, that they would look that way on the outside. And even nowadays, even now we know that's not true. We still tend to mistake beauty for goodness. We tend to think that people who are good looking are smarter than they are, nicer than they are. It seems to be a universal human tendency, even though it's so manifestly not true, and we all know it.
It's hard to fight with biology, isn't it?
What?
It's hard to fight with our biology, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we're wired to respond to beautiful forms, physical forms, probably. Anyway, we're diverging a little bit. Let's get back to the next question, which is the role of the body in Paradiso and the role of shadow as a counterpart to that. Who wants to take that?
Well, it was pointed out in the chat that we're overwhelmed by light, so there's not much room for an actual shadow to occur. And that for
Yeah.
things to appear, they're already deforming their current existence just so that they can come into sensible contact with Dante and his limitations. So the thing that happens with light in this isn't about so much dark as about how much light there really is that he had never seen before.
Okay. Doug?
And the, sorry.
Go ahead. Go
And
ahead.
the dancing lights circle Dante and Beatrice. And so that is a classic photographic bounce, not bounce lighting. Bounce lighting is when you do it off of a big surface, like the sand on a beach on a cloudy day. There are no shadows because the light's bouncing off the beach. But in this case, there is an exercise where you shoot a photo, and in my high school photography class, where you move a light around the object on a very long exposure, and it removes all the shadows because the light is moving. And here we have so many moving lights that I think the shadows vanish.
Interesting. Very interesting. Madeline, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, this is fascinating. And what Isabel said sparked a thought in me. Basically, Dante is trying to talk about multidimensional beings, but I would almost call them like a multidimensional ongoing event that can only be condensed in our brains, in our four-dimensional brains, with the 3 dimensions of space plus time, and that this is something that actually comes up in the world of let's call it neurology. I don't know. I think they call it something like neurotheology or something. But basically, the idea is that that there are all these things about our brain science and our relationships to other mammals that show that it's normal for us to sense an unseen presence. There are things in our brain that make us do that. It's normal for us to feel flooded with feeling. This is the chemical cascade, blah, blah, blah. The argument on the other side, which is equally valid, is that these things are happening. And so, of course, they formed our brains in such a way that we could perceive them. And so I think that from where we are as human beings, there isn't a way to resolve the question, at least not at this point. If I made the question, or not even a question, the 2 sides of the coin clear.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else want to tackle this one? The thorny question of the body, the material.
In the future, you will see I corpi gloriosi, the glorious bodies. To Dante, the body was 100% important. That's why Beatrice is important. Beatrice is terribly. I was telling the other group about the incarnational poetry. This is incarnational poetry. Beatrice has to be a real person, a real body at one time, and she was. She can't just be a poetic invention, a symbol, or something, or a metaphor, or something like that. She's got to be real. And she was in Dante's life. But there is a canto somewhere in the upper Paradiso where the souls long for resurrection, long for the resurrection. Why? Not so much for themselves, if I remember correctly, Dante says, not so much for themselves, but because it would be so wonderful to see our grandfather, great-grandfather, father, dead sister, dead brother. How wonderful to see these people again. So this is with this longing, and they will have il corpo, they will have the body, but it will be il corpo glorioso. So we wait for these glorious bodies to be.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Doug? You're on mute. He's on mute.
I found myself thinking a lot about your image, which you threw out very early on about the seal and the wax, and matter in the body is the warm wax upon which God imprints something on, which then or the stars do. And that's where CJ wanted me to talk about the one and the many, like he was giving me a homework assignment, but in a way I kept running across that too, because the prime mover on his sphere is immediately broken up into many stars. And then the influence of the stars then move into lower layers and more material layers and then affect us here on Earth. So the one is immediately fragmented into the myriad stars. And then that comes, and all through that is the image of the seal onto something else, onto wax, onto something, and that the image that's imprinted is not wax, and it's not the prime mover, it's something, it's a design, which is sort of very metaphysical in Bucky's terms, you know, associated with the mind, not the brain even, you know, it's like that, the thing that imprints and inspires, that drives you, that pushes you. So that's sort of, the body seems to be the holder of these influences. And he actually does do something very close to Bucky, where Bucky felt we're all designed to do something special. Dante sort of says all these stars and influences affect each person in a different way, and each person should do their own work. I mean, he really makes that clear, that when people are doing somebody else's work is when we get messed up. You know, we got to do our own work.
Right.
And I think that's what Beatrice tears him apart for at the end of Purgatory, because he hasn't been doing his own work. He got the message early on and he abandoned it. He walked away from the work.
Interesting. I want to both answer and also maybe comment and maybe let Isabel respond to me. So as I was reading some commentaries on this, pretty much this question about the body, several commentators noted that, you know, in Inferno, everything is very physical, very expressive, very tactile. You know, the woods, the woods of the suicides, you know, all these pictures, they're extremely physical, extremely almost, what's the word? Hyper real. They're hyper real. When you get to Purgatorio, that tone, that intensity definitely tones down. We definitely go like several octaves down on this gamut, on this division, gradation. Now, when you get to Paradiso, it's even more toned down, where you don't really see the people that you encounter. You don't see their facial features. You don't really see, you see they're clothed in light. Now, I take your point, Isabel, and I agree with you about the fact that the only reason why that's happening is because Dante is not able to perceive it, and neither are we. We can't perceive it as it is. And therefore, the only thing we can see physically is just the light. However that may be, the effect of that as readers for us is that Paradiso, the way it strikes us, is much more dematerialized than either the Inferno or the earthly paradise of Purgatorio. What do you make of that? What are your thoughts? And this is a question specifically for Isabel, because she brought up the original point.
Yes, the Paradiso is immaterial, but there's one point that I just want to make clear, more immaterial, and certainly than hell or purgatory. One point I want to make clear that I did kind of talk about in the breakout group is that Dante knows this. Dante knows that there's going to be a marked difference. He wrote the poem, for goodness sakes. He wrote the poem not piecemeal. He wrote the poem. He could see the structure of the poem from day one. So he didn't just, it wasn't he didn't wing it. So that he knows that, Philip, he knows that as you approach Paradiso, you're going to get not Inferno stuff. You're not going to have sex and violence. You're not going to have tactile stuff. You're not going to have people with shitty nails. You're not going to have any of that. It's going to be light upon light upon light. How do you paint that? Where are the artists? How do you paint light upon light? You can't. But, and this is why I say in the very first canto, he says, look, you guys, what I'm telling you is going to be hard. This matter is rare. It's very, very difficult to understand. Certainly you in your little crafts, you're not going to understand it. Go back. And I was telling the little group we were in that no, on the contrary, Dante is using a rhetorical ploy for you to not go back and actually become more interested. What, you're telling me I can't do this? Oh, yeah.
A little bit of reverse psychology.
That's what, in my opinion, and I haven't read on this, but I'm almost sure, because because Dante does not want to lose you in the peak point that he's trying to make. Why would he want to say, go away in his punchline? Why? But he knows his punchline is hard, arduous, difficult. He knows it.
Right.
But he doesn't want to lose you. Not any one of us, he doesn't want to lose.
Thank you.
Somebody mentioned Virgil, but I was telling you, Virgil didn't read his poem.
Right. Okay. All right. Let's move on. The next question is should be pretty simple. How many spheres? Do we have a consensus? You want to hold up a number? How many spheres do we have total? Anybody?
Probably 9.
9. Anybody disagree with that?
I don't understand the question. I'm sorry.
The question was, how many spheres are there total?
Oh, spheres. I'm
Spheres.
sorry. I have hearing aids, but it doesn't help. Nove, right? 9.
Yeah, nine.
And
So-
also all around 9.
So we have 7 planets, right? Including the sun and the moon, which are considered planets. And then we have the Empyrean, which is the fiery region. And then we have the Primum Mobile, right? That's the original that moves all the other spheres. That's 9 altogether. And by the way, I was reading, I don't know if you guys are interested in some of the influences on Dante in putting together this astronomical picture or skeleton for us. Obviously, a lot of these ideas come from Plato's Timaeus, Aristotle, but the one that's actually even more recent and maybe more sort of explicit is the dream of Scipio. Is anyone familiar with that? The dream of Scipio, that's the story of Scipio Africanus, the younger. He has this dream in which he sees his grandfather, who is telling him about the afterlife and the different setups in afterlife. But among other things, he explicitly tells him there are 9 spheres, and he lists them in the same exact order that Dante has them. And he also mentions this idea of the music of the spheres, which there's several allusions to this music I think in Canto II, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe someone else can correct me. And of course, there's dancing. So the picture that we have, I mean, it's a beautiful picture, whatever you think about it in physical terms, but the picture that we have is this revolution, which causes a harmonious musical sound, and there's this dancing. So it's really quite a setup we have of dancing, music, and light. That's the backdrop of all of this. Okay, next question is, let's see.
Let me touch on something quickly about the spheres. I think there's a 10th heaven that's in a chart in the Dorothy Sayers translation, which once you go through the 9 things, then that's where the multifoliate rose is. And that's sort of, and it sort of echoes the Sufi idea of nafs. Nafs are the blocks to God. And I think it's often called, is the donkey riding me or am I riding the donkey? And so you work through the donkey. And I think Francis actually called his body my little donkey, and so you work through these nafs And then you get to God. God is the 10th level. There's, or something even beyond God. I mean, it's something, you know,
Right.
which the cloud of unknowing kind of points to that as well. Once you get beyond all these names and symbols, the English mystical text, the cloud of unknowing, the medieval text sort of points to that. You work through these things and then you get to something that you can't name and that you can, I don't know. So.
Well, last question that I have is about this idea of being blessed with free will and its relationship to the contingent will, and how it all works out. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
David, go ahead.
Yeah. So he describes free will as the greatest gift that's given to humans and or to intelligent creatures, because it's the way we can do something and at the same time be with God, because our consent and God's consent are simultaneously together. And so when we give consent, God gives consent. So and that's why it can't be taken back when you make a vow, because God's given something and you can't take it back. This is a pretty high connection with those high levels, those stratosphere, those ionospheres, you know. If it's our greatest gift, that doesn't mean that it always works out well for us, because the playing out in the cases that we've seen so far, and I don't know where it goes in the rest of Paradiso, this is my first reading. It seems that we kind of have to take responsibility for what our vows do and what our free will has started. And that seems to be beyond a human capability. So it's once you start something, it's sort of out of your control, but you're still responsible for everything you do about it. So there it's a kind of a burden. That gets to be not such a apparent blessing if you have to martyr because of what you have already committed to. So how can you unequivocally answer this question? If you know the depiction of the martyr who, as he's being burnt, it has to be turned because this is, you know, he wants to be cooked to perfection because this is what's required of him. You know, how can we answer what that means in human terms? That's a tough one to parse the question.
Yep. Anyone else want to add to that?
Not to that, but I just wanted to say the 10th sphere is the Empyrean, the rose.
Right.
Madeline, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, at a meetup, I believe it was last fall, there was a Jungian analyst talking, and he talked about a theory that I forget what psychologist had it, that all human sexual perversions are actually based on religion. So I won't elaborate, but I think you can all think of examples.
Well, couldn't it be vice versa, that all religions ban things that are sexual, that are desires society wants to countermand?
Yeah, that could be.
Sorry, did that relate to the free will, or was that something just to comment on other things?
I'd like to comment on the free will because we debated this when I was growing up, actually in the Mormon church, and my dad was a Berkeley Mormon, and free will was a big thing. And in this, I get the sense we're given the free will and then we're expected to give it back. You know, it was a great gift, so we have to give it back. And I think there's some truth to that, but it takes a long time to really get to the point where you can give it back. You know, and it's often interpreted like he's given this free will to you. So here are the 10 commandments. You got to buy everything and all the canon law and all the, you know, it's like suddenly you're in a trap, which I don't think is the freedom that Dante is really getting at. So the conditional will, the absolute will of these nuns who are devoted and have vowed themselves to God to be the bride of God, and then their brothers want to marry them off to get a lot of money and power. And so that's the conditional will where they have to make an adjustment. And so That's an acting term where you have an objective and then you are blocked and then you have to adjust and go around it and you have to do other things. So the conditions, and it's often called the given circumstances, which are the that's common acting terminology. Your action, your objective, then the given circumstances, the obstacles, and the route you have to take to get to your objective.
Well, two points about this.
And not seeing yourself as free that forces you to be reduced to condition. You're still free, but you're not being free.
Mhm.
You're not what? Being free?
Yeah, if you elect to go on with your family and do what they tell you, you're not acting free. You're acting as though you are not free.
Well,
Well, and then he says they could go back. They could go back to what they vowed, but they don't. They stay married.
right. I think the point is that, like as Doug pointed out, is you have the free will. You can give it up, and at that point, yes, you are not free, but you're freely choosing to be not free. I guess that's the paradox.
That's not free will. That's denying your freedom, right? That's giving away the gift that you had infinite value.
Well, let me give an illustration. Maybe, and I don't know if these stories are apocryphal, but I actually probably some of them are true. In the ancient world, there was a tradition where you could free a slave. At that point, that slave could do whatever he wants. But there were cases apparently where a slave would then give himself up to be the slave of that person for life, and nothing could free him after that. And that was maybe in the Gospels where, a lot of these writers, Paul and Peter included, they write of themselves as servants of Christ. That word for servant is the word for slaves, the same word. So the idea was that you freely give up your free will to God. You become slave of God because of love, because of whatever it is. That's the picture, I think. Whether or not it's an idealistic picture, whether or not it works in real life is a different question. But what they describe is that type of scenario where you give up your freedom willingly. And that's the freedom that you have to do it. Now, once you do it, you're no longer free. That's the paradox, I guess. But maybe, and I'm curious if anyone else will say this too. In Paradiso, there's that point where they say, we're peaceful, even though we're not in the highest sphere, because we've given up, our will is to will what God wills. So therefore we're at peace. And maybe that's what that giving up of that free will, maybe that's what gives you back, is that freedom from sort of fretting and fighting and maybe whatever. Again, I don't necessarily agree with that. Maybe outside of paradise, but that seems to be the picture. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on that. Allison, go ahead, Allison.
I was looking for it. I can't remember where I found it, but I remember there was a point where Beatrice is saying to him about free will, and she's saying, the idea is that you need to think very, very carefully before you make a vow, and don't just rush into the vow. Absolutely. And I think that's the whole idea, is that frequently people can't sustain a vow because they rush into it so quickly that they don't really understand what they've gotten themselves into, or they don't really know this person well enough to know whether or not, can you really make a vow to this person to last 50 years? You don't know them,
Right.
And people do it all the time. I mean, and also before people would grow up with somebody, them your entire life. But now you see, you see people marrying someone, they meet them, in 2 years, they're like, let's get married. And then they're like, who are you? Who are you? Oh no. So I think that's what she's saying, is just slow down and really think this one through.
Yeah. David, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, the way I wanted to say it was, if freedom is not a bunch of things, like I want to do what I want to feel good. If freedom is having the ability to choose God's will, to choose law, to choose the right choice, and giving it up for any reason, for anybody else's will or anything else, saying, I'm doing something's will, is some kind of conditional will.
Mhm.
But if you choose God's will and you commit to that, Eved Elohim, to be a servant of God, which slave, servant, there's a little distinction here, but then you're giving up to be someone with free will, to do the good things. So you're not giving away your autonomy, you're committing to God's will, which is exactly what it means to be autonomous and free to do the right thing. So if you choose any other kind of commitment, you're giving, that's where it becomes conditional. So it's insufficient. It's like a lower level.
Right. Well, in the context that we are talking about vows made to God, so that would apply, right?
About what?
In the context, we're talking about vows made to God, not to other people. So
Right. So when your family grabs you and says, marry this person, make a vow to them, you're vowing to something like, I can no longer be committed to the vow to God. Right.
When I was growing up, they would say the only thing that keeps you from becoming an animal is free will. That is what the church preached. And I think it's still the same.
interesting. Yeah. Okay, one more question that we have is what are the qualities of the spheres? What are the qualities of the spheres? Where do they derive the qualities from? What's the nature of these spheres that we're seem to be jumping from one to another like frogs very easily? What's the anyone want to tackle that one?
Say it one more time. I'm sorry.
What are the
It's
qualities? What are the qualities of the spheres?
Oh,
Well,
What's the
they
nature of-
they do each seem to have a different quality of light. And they also, sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
Go for it.
They have a different quality of light, and also they have different people giving monologues. Like in on the moon, Beatrice gives a long talk. That's in Canto IV. I call it Moon 2. Canto 5 is Moon 3. She's still talking. In Canto 6, we have a talk by, okay, so there's Mercury. I've written, it's a political canto. Discussion of Caesar was I and I am Justinian. Here's the eagle that Doug was talking about. So they have different, first of all, they have different emblems in the way that different saints had emblems or attributes. You know, like Lucy would be holding her eyes on a platter. So it seems as if the spheres all have something that kind of is recognizable in that way. And they have different people talking. Mercury 2, where was the one? There was a very long talk by, I think it was Thomas Aquinas.
That's the sun.
Okay, that was the sun.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think that they have a different person who's the primary speaker, and they also have different qualities of light to them. And I think that even though we've lost a lot of the physical qualities of the first two books, we do still have a lot of talk about light and optics and mirrors here. As well as we still have a few boats. We have some birds of prey, we have the eagle, but we no longer have the little sparrows and all the falconry metaphors. And we don't have the horse taming metaphors either.
The light of the moon was much gentler than the light of the sun, but they also had different motives for, like examining the motives of earthly acclaim. If you did the right thing, it wasn't so bad, but that was not a pure motive, so you could only get so far.
Yeah, I think well, go ahead, Doug.
Now, that triggered something. That is the level of ambition. So there's, I think, the moon, which where it's changeable. You've made a vow and it changes, and then the Mercury is really the ambition, and that's the longest monologue. It's a full canto, and it's Justinian talking about the acts of the eagle, where the eagle goes, and then but the ambitious, the thing that I wanted to pick up from what David said, is in the Greek world. I talked to a Greek scholar, and she said hubris and ambition was not necessarily a bad thing. It often led to good things for the community, like Oedipus cures the plague, but it leads to his destruction, at least in social terms. He's exiled. So the flaw that we call a flaw or a sin is actually something society needs, but it usually destroys the hero while
Right.
often helping other people. So that's that level of ambition there. They're doing God's will, but they're doing it for their own ego. To a great degree. And then the next level is the sun, and that's the wise guys. Love, Venus and love, and then the sun, and that's the wise men, Thomas Aquinas. And so they're each one has a certain sort of, that you go from love to wisdom is directly, and then from, changeability to ambition to love to wisdom. And I can't remember, I'm not trying to anticipate it and be fresh to what comes next. So I'll stop there,
Well, when it's
Spoiler alert.
sorry.
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that all of these qualities are moral in their underlying nature. And that's I guess the key point that Dante makes through Beatrice, is to say that all of these spheres are moral, and therefore they exhibit themselves, express themselves in these different ways. And that's really like the leitmotif throughout the whole thing, the morality of it all. And also there's an important distinction that's coming up. I think we're already starting to see it in the sun, is as we move away from the earth, there's less and less of a deficiency present in these spheres. So at some point, there will not be any kind of deficiency. They'll just have different, maybe emphasis on different sides of our character, but not necessarily a deficiencies in itself. Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time. So unless there's any other pressing question, I think I want to thank everyone for participating. It was a great time. Lots of good questions, good discussion, and we will see everyone in a month, approximately.
Bill and Doug, thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Thank you all. I mean, I really love the feedback from everybody.
Right. Okay. Okay. Take care, everybody.
Okay, good night.
Good night.